Well, family, we're back. Life on Side B ended and you're already getting new content. I told you, it wasn't the end, it was a transition. And we're already bringing you some new stuff. But this isn't a Life on Side B episode. A Side B collective, which some of you have heard of before from Johanna Marie and Grant, which if you haven't, you'll hear a little bit more about it in a bit. They are taking over the podcast. And we're going to have a conversation about a piece that I wrote with them. So I'm going to hand it over to Chase and Shelby. Shelby, you all have heard on the podcast before, but Chase, none of you have heard of before. So why don't you guys introduce yourselves and tell us why we're here? What are we doing?
Hello. So I am Shelby, and I think I've been on the podcast once before.
Yeah. Yeah, you were on with Johanna Marie and Sarah, I think.
Yes, yes. But I'm really excited to chat today. I am one of the writers for a Side B Collective. Um, and I really love writing about kind of the everyday experience of being Side B people, of how do we actually like live life as kind of Side B people in the church, in culture, in the world. So I'm really excited to have this conversation with Josh, and I am here with Chase, who's also one of the great writers for Side B Collective.
Is true. And yeah, it's wonderful to be here. First time ever on a podcast, actually. So I am very excited. I know. And normally I love writing. And so it's kind of exciting to get to talk about writing today. Yeah. And speaking of which, like Shelby said, I also write for a Side B collective, which for those who haven't checked us out yet or heard about, we are a kind of newer collective, about a year now, I believe. We've just been writing, sharing stories, sharing thought pieces from a Side B perspective in particular. Not all of our works are geared on sexuality per se, but we all have that in common in having the Side B experience. I think it's a really good group. We are soliciting for guest writers. Yeah, and we're really, really excited to get to talk with Josh today about a piece that he has written for us called The Case for Civil Marriage in Celibate Partnerships. And I think it's great because, like, let's just go for it.
Let's just go for it.
Exactly. Before we get into it, Josh, I was just really excited that you were like, hey, I have this idea for this piece. Would a Side B collective be interested in posting it, sharing it? And I think Shelby can fill in the gaps too, but we were all just excited to talk about this because it is something that is definitely coming up in Side B spaces. But for those of us who aren't, at least for myself, in Celibate Partnerships, this is not a world that we get to experience or we don't get to hear a lot about, I suppose. So I was just excited. We've been friends for a while now. I was excited to get to hear your thoughts on this, and maybe that could be our lead in. What was it that inspired you to write this piece?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, I want to say thank you so much for you guys for like taking the chance on this piece because it's not the simplest of pieces. And I remember mentioning that, like, why not? It was like my catchphrase in the final season of Live on CB. What are they going to do? Just say.
What are they going to do? What are they going to do?
Yeah, I think that there was a few factors that inspired me to write this piece. Currently, obviously in the United States, we are in a very intriguing political climate. And I would say, especially around Project 2025 and the Trump administration, for those who have not read up on Project 2025, one of the points of it, which is a conservative think tank's view of what the Trump administration should employ, is the reversal of the Supreme Court decision on same-sex marriage. That's one of the goals of Project 2025. And while there can be a whole discussion about the actual extent that the Trump administration is playing on this, there are correlations. That's all I'm going to say. There are connections. And we have even seen states like Idaho putting forward some steps of requesting the Supreme Court to reconsider this. And so this has been a discussion point even before this year with the overturning of Roe v. Wade and all of this stuff. It just created questions about what other Supreme Court decisions could be overturned. And we're probably going to talk about this a little bit more. This is why this has propelled some other legislations that have been put in place, but it has caused for, I mean, I think most queer people in general, but anyone who's in any kind of partnership to question, should we do this? Should we get civilly married? Mm-hmm. And I think celibate partnerships are some of those people that have been starting to process this, because there are benefits, there are privileges, there's protections that are given to civil marriage that are not given to other relationships. But what I think is interesting that hit me within that scenario is that the conversations around civil marriage and legal protections is something that has been happening within the circles of people in celibate partnerships for ever. Like, as long as it's been around, that's been a part of the conversation about what does this look like to have legal protection around your partnership. But I was fascinated that as this has become a little bit more risen to the avail of like the broader Side B community, that there was a disconnect. That, like, for instance, in my mind, as someone in a celibate partnership who is not civilly married, I'm going to go ahead and like declare that I'm writing this as someone who is not civilly married. Because I know that will be the natural thinking is, oh, Josh is writing this because he's civilly married. I'm not actually. And I think that I assumed we were all, as a Side B community, on the same page on this topic. And granted, we're not, because we're not even on the same page on celibate partnerships in general.
I was going to say, Side B on the same page?
Side B on the same page? Never. But I just realized, wow, part of the reason why we are at this point is because these conversations just aren't happening. So I really felt like there was a disconnect, because celibate partners are having these conversations, but away from the rest of the Side B community. And I felt like we're at a point this needs to happen. Our organization leaders, our thinkers, and our broader community need to propel. Because I also don't think, the last thing I'll say here, I don't think this just affects celibate partners, which we can talk about later on. I think this plays into a bigger conversation within Side B. So all of those things just made me go, we need to talk about this. And I felt in a unique space, I think, as a person who's not civilly married. So I can come across this as like, I haven't even taken up this thing, but also I'm afforded an ability to talk on these topics that other people in celibate partnerships do not have.
Yeah. I feel like you mentioned that this has been around like forever. So I'm wondering, how have your kind of thoughts on just civil partnership and like civil marriage, celibate partnerships in general have been changed by like being in a partnership versus before? Like, how have your thoughts evolved on this topic to get to where you are today?
Yeah, so deeply. I still remember the person who invited me to a Side B space for the first time. I was already Side B. I didn't have that language, but the first time ever was Meg Botts, good old Meg Botts. And yes, we love her. And she was inviting me to one of the Facebook groups, and she was just alerting me, hey, this is a diverse group. There's a lot of people in a lot of different relationship formats, including celibate partners. And I was like, what is that? I said it in other words, but I said, what is that? And she explained it. And I was like, that is the stupidest thing I have ever heard. And I think it was one of these things where I was coming out of being engaged to a man and then becoming celibate. And it wasn't within the framework, and it felt very, a lot of times people who move from affirming positions to more Side B positions, I actually find we often are much more stringent around our views of Side B, which is a whole nother conversation.
That is something that is an interesting phenomenon.
Yeah. If you look at people with a lot more rigidity, it's often people who originally had a more affirming view. But I definitely was in that realm. And I will say that I didn't begin exploring really celibate partners, like the idea of celibate partnerships, until there was someone who I was intrigued by the possibility of. That opened up my thought process to go, so what is this? What is this thing? And I think critics can easily take that to argue that, my desire to be in a celibate partnership meant I was going to like close my eyes to whatever the issues were. But I would actually argue that that didn't make me suddenly a proponent of celibate partnerships in general. It actually just propelled me to reevaluate my boxes. Because I ultimately think the greatest challenge of celibate partnerships is that they don't fit in boxes. Like we want to put them in specific boxes of a romantic relationship, of a marriage, of a friendship, of roommates. And it's like, that's all kind of true. Like there are overlaps with other relationship formats and things. But now granted, all of that was me before even getting into a partnership. I think that, and we're probably going to talk about this a little bit later on. One of the things that helped that I already had a distinction of the two, of civil marriage and celibate partnerships, related to my thoughts on that, was living in Colombia. Because I was already, even before I entered the Side B community, I lived in Colombia, which, for those of you who have read the piece, which if you're listening to this, you probably should go read the piece if you have.
Please read the piece beforehand.
Please do.
If you stop, press pause real fast and just read it. Then come back. We'll be here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We never said that, and I think that's important to say. Go read the piece.
Yeah, it's out there.
Which it's in the show notes, everyone. There will be a link to it in the show notes. But I think that living in Colombia, where for the most part, Christian marriage or spiritual marriage in general and civil marriage are separate. You have your legal wedding and you have your Christian wedding. So I already had that framework. So I already came into it going, oh, this is something, normal. Like this is understandable, like how these two things are different. That I wonder what that would have been like if I didn't have that exposure beforehand. So I think in some ways it has been formed. It has shifted. Definitely now being in like a lifelong committed partnership for more than 4 years has really changed my vantage point of understanding things.
Sure.
But I would say the part of civil marriage intriguingly is like actually one of the points that really rooted from not living in the United States for a long time.
I also just appreciate, Josh, your sharing like the kind of full experience of what it means to like, okay, so here are the convictions I hold to. How do I actually continue to adjust my life and still hold to the convictions that I have? Like, I think that's the part that people may misinterpret, is that, like, oh, we're changing convictions. No, it's like trying to find out how I can live and hold to the convictions that I have.
Yeah.
Like, how do I actually have a sustainable life, a life that is actually flourishing? And I appreciate that you allow yourself the flexibility to do that.
And I'll say one thing there is like I actually have to give credit to that for being formed in the Colombian church. Not even just for the situation of that, but just the Colombian Protestant church often is a very poor church compared to many other places. And so it taught me a creativity around church that just in general was needed, because the government doesn't really care about the Protestant church very much. And on top of that, they don't have a lot of money. So it was like, well, we're going to use the law as we can, but then ultimately figure out other ways around it. So I think, that's been one of my goals. And that's what I'm hoping people can take from this piece, is that it's not about changing the beliefs. It's just about separating government from church.
Interesting. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Maybe we can go back a little bit. So your piece, you write in there, once in a partnership, many find that privacy, even secrecy, are their greatest modes of protection. And something that struck me and a few other writers in the collective when we read that part was that line is so reminiscent of the closeted experience.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you could expound on that a little bit more. Like, what are the reasons for this secrecy, and also what are the effects that it has on the people in partnership and just to the larger community in general?
Yeah, I love that y'all as an author team made that connotation with the closet, because I was like, oh, that's so true. I think I even joked, I was like, that's a piece, the closet of celibate partnerships.
I think I remember that. Yeah.
Yeah. If y'all are up for it, maybe that's another piece I write. Who knows?
We might have to. Yeah.
I think one distinction I would make is that this kind of closet experience, this privacy and secrecy experience, I don't always think means hiding the very fact that you're in a relationship at all. But I think it's hiding specific dynamics. It can mean hiding your relationship as a whole, but it can be hiding the different dynamics, maybe language you use, maybe the distinctions of whether you live together or not, or different aspects of those things. I think the main drivers I would put into three categories. I think one is consequences in work, especially if you work in ministry, I think is a huge one. Um, and I don't always think it's necessarily about your employer finding out. It's often about audiences or donors finding out that they don't understand.
Hmm.
I find is that there can be a level of being known. And I think as long as that works for people, a lot of times people realize like, hey, as long as these close people I know, as long as my employer knows or something to that extent, I can hide in this more other way. I think there's other aspects of secrecy around work that, for instance, as many of the listeners know, my partner works in HIV in a lot of public health space. And most people just assume we're a married gay couple. And it's sometimes kind of like there's going to create more risk of like explaining the celibacy part. I mean, in general, it's going to, but then on top of it, to say that you're a celibate partnership is going to create that even more. So we also deal with the level of secrecy from his work of just like kind of how we maneuver talking about our relationship around his work. And again, it's never about necessarily being fired, but sometimes there can be for a lot of people of fear of ordination process if you work for a church, and fear of loss of donations, loss of all of these things that if people make the assumptions around it, that is going to cause a problem. I think another and a very, very big one is like family or church dynamics. I myself have experienced the breakdown of multiple relationships since entering this partnership with Christian, even from literally the first few months of deciding to pursue a partnership. I lost relationship with family and very committed friends. So that is something that a lot of us experience. And I think that a part of it for me that realized was there's a reality sometimes that we experience where people are okay with the idea of us being gay until they have to see it.
Yes.
Oh my gosh.
That's the reality.
Yeah.
Right? Oh my God, we could go on that forever. But I think that, and I don't think that applies to just if you're in partnership, but that's a huge thing. Like the fact that I have a partner and now that means Christian's going to be in family pictures. That means, Christian's going to be going to different events and things like that. That makes a difference, And I would say my family of origin, like my parents are amazing. My parents love him. We just went to lunch yesterday with my parents. They're great. But a lot of people experience breakdown of deep relationships in their life because it's just too hard. And there's too many questions. There's too much suspicion, all of those things. Church dynamics, I think, are another big thing. If you are already in a church and then you get into a partnership, there can be a lot of questions depending on what kind of church it is, all of those things. And then the last thing I would just say is a heightened level of suspicion from those around you, just in general. Like there's this feeling of like people want to be your accountability partner. And it's like, cool, didn't invite you into that space, but thank you. So I think that a lot of these different kinds of things propel people in celibate partnerships to question then, am I going to change my circumstances or am I going to have privacy? And for some of us, we figure out that we can live with a certain amount of privacy, as long as the specific people in your life know. Then the other people, I don't have to refer to this person as my partner. I can refer them by another name, or I can maneuver it some way, not post about it in specific ways. People do it in all different formats. Or other people go, no, I can't stay in this situation. I need to find a different church that's going to support us. I need to find a different work, those kinds of areas. So we all kind of navigate it. But I do think everyone finds that privacy and secrecy, being very guarded about what you share, is one of the greatest modes of protection.
So kind of related to that and like a coming out experience, what have been the benefits for you of like being open about your partnership? Like what have been like the fruit? Because I know like kind of using the parallel of the closet of like what are like the benefits of the openness for you?
Yeah, I think that again, thankfully that now that I've moved away from like donor-based ministry, and I'm kind of in a place where, I mean, except for my church, I guess if like people didn't want, because like, yes, I do have income from my church. I think one of the beautiful things is feeling integration of like my life, like how you know me here and how you know me here. This is me. This is just who I am. Yeah. And there are still ways that I just don't always feel the need to explain aspects, but it's not out of a thing of hiding. It's just a matter of like, I don't want to give you more details right now. That's fine. So I think that I would say the greatest benefit of being able to speak more openly is this feeling of integration, is this feeling of wholeness, kind of a grounding in the reality that who I am, who people know me as, is who I am. And I don't have to fear who finds something out because, you know, if you find out something you don't like, okay, you know, cool.
Yeah.
But so I think that would be the greatest thing within ours.
Yeah. I mean, I resonate with that, even though, you know, as someone who's not in a celibate partnership, I just think that idea of having integration, being able to be in one, like, be as you say you are, I suppose, like, that is kind of, I think, the general goal that we all have in how we live our lives, or it should be, I would hope. And there are limiting circumstances, and it's a shame to me that not by fault of anyone in celibate partnerships, but by fault of maybe just misunderstandings of those who aren't, we can't seem to have an environment where people are trying to pursue celibate partnerships, or even just going through questions on, like we're talking about today, civil marriage. We can't do that out in the open as much.
Yeah.
And so, again, just really grateful for this piece. Again, I'm going to plug it. Read it. Yeah. Shelby, do you have another question too you want to ask?
No, I guess that kind of connects with um, kind of this, not the secrecy, but the discretion aspect that you talk about a little bit about the piece with civil marriage. Do you feel like that would add on to the like lack of integration aspect? Like, how do you feel like that would interact with that kind of wanting to be to other people like 100% of like who you are, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that civil marriage does play a big part in it. And again, I think a big aspect of that is that not even in the side B space is everyone agreed. I mean, first of all, not everyone in the side B space has agreed with celibate partnerships, let alone civilly married partners, you know? And so I think that it creates a level of barrier even within our own community. I think community of access within different spaces, different parts of our community. I think as someone in ministry also, there's a lot of aspects of how other people are going to receive it, people in your life, organizations that are important, you know, when you're in ministry, you know, how your church is going to receive it, how all of those things.
Yeah.
So it just adds another layer on top of an already really complex situation. And that's where I think that people have to weigh. And that's why I really wanted to say in this piece, and I'm going to say it here again, and I'm going to try and say it a bunch of times. This piece is not about saying that celibate partners should be married. This is simply saying that there are a lot of challenges coming up on people in celibate partnerships. I think the side B community in general is about to start facing a plausibility crisis question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Of like, how do we do this long term? And I think we need all of the tools in our tool belt. And I think taking this out actually only hurts us and doesn't help. So I am really just more advocating that we keep every tool available. And if this is something you need when you reevaluate what the benefits are, what are the concerns, what are the like restrictions, to determine if that's going to be helpful for you.
Yeah. Josh, kind of on that point, or working off of that a bit, you mentioned in several in this piece, but for our audience listening right now, could you mention a few benefits or considerations that are available to those who are like civilly married that are not available to those who are either not partnered or even in a civil union? Because like for me, for instance, like I'm in Illinois and we do still have civil unions in place. I thought was helpful reading through your piece was like there are certain things that I think are covered by civil unions in Illinois, for instance. But there are certain things that are not covered because it's not federally understood. Could you talk through a few of those distinctions maybe for those who are just not aware of any of what the legal status is like, I guess?
I mean, and that's the funny part. I didn't really know either until we had to talk through it, you know, and then I looked up all of this stuff and I'm like, whoa. And I mean, I think the main one that we all think of is the federal tax benefit. And this is especially important if one partner makes more than the other or offsets the income of the other partner. That is where there is a lot of tax benefit for federally recognized marriage that is not given to civil unions. Civil unions may, depending on the state, give that tax benefit for state income tax, but they would not apply to federal income tax. And then obviously, very few states actually still have civil unions since the passing of same-sex marriage by the Supreme Court. A lot of them got rid of it because of that. So the tax benefits are a very big one. Estate planning, inheritance, there are a lot of ways that it can make it a lot easier to formulate inheritance of estates, households, properties, all of the things with that.
Yeah.
I would say a big, huge one, and one that also plays into that secrecy complexity aspect of it, is immigration and visas. I mean, we are living in a time where in the United States, immigration is like, you don't know, and this isn't even just about undocumented individuals, but also anyone on any kind of visa. All visas are kind of up in the air. Yet, visas and residencies through marriage are one of the most stable visas that exist in our country across partisan lines, regardless of who is in the White House. Marriage is often one of the strongest routes to that, and I think that that's really important. One of the hard parts that I will say in that creates a complexity for celibate partners that are pursuing civil marriage is you kind of have to be careful how you're probably going to talk about it. So if you are decide to get civilly married, but you're wanting to clarify to your friends, hey, we don't see it as a church marriage, that could easily get flagged by immigration to be like, so you don't see your marriage
especially
as a real
in this
marriage.
climate.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I think that also what makes this hard is that you have some people who, if they want to do that, they even have to be careful for immigration, how they're going to speak about it. So they might even be on the other side, have a privacy around the celibacy aspect. So there's all these kind of complex things. Healthcare access is a really big one, especially in states that don't have civil marriage. Many times government employees and other employers only allow benefit sharing to spouses. And that's a huge thing, especially in our country where there's not a lot of access to really affordable healthcare insurance. So, and then I would say another thing across that is actually there is statistical work that shows married couples, civilly married couples, are charged less for insurance across the board. I believe all insurance is a scam.
Okay.
So that's a whole nother thing. But home insurance, auto insurance, health insurance, often civilly married couples are charged less because they're seen as a lower risk and more stable.
Wow, love that.
Let's
Don't you
be
love
real.
that?
I am a high risk and I am always unstable. So I don't know if they're exactly
That is true.
wrong.
That is true.
I just don't like that they called it out like that. But
But
I'm also not having kids, so I just feel like
so that's like, and I think it's also worth noting that some of the other one is hospital visits, emergency decision making. And with all of these, you might hear some of these going, well, you can take care of that. Like, emergency decision making, you can take care of that at power of attorney. Inheritance, you can take care of with the will. Absolutely. But there's some ways that either some of these are just not accessible through other ways, and others it can, but it becomes much more complex, much more expensive. And so depending on your economics, like depending on your income, depending on social barriers and stuff, that it might be easier to go to a courthouse and get, a marriage certificate opposed to going through all of these other means. So I just think that these are things to understand, that it's even a difference from civil unions sometimes, depending on the state. And also, many of us live in states like Florida does not have any recognized civil union. Yeah. Our county has a domestic partnership thing, but that's only going to affect county things. Like, a county can't set something up that then's going to have effects federally or state-wise. So depending on where you live, it might be a little bit different, but for the most part, these are limitations that we all have.
Yeah. And I think what you talk about too in the piece is like, and I think we can come back to this part in a minute too, but you talk about like, clearly this is not sustainable, and that like this is not good for society in general, that only that these benefits, these rights to care and care for and be cared by our loved ones,
Mhm.
that's only guaranteed by marriage, and for a certain extent, and clearly that's not sustainable, that's not a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
But you do challenge us in this piece is like, well, what do we do about it? Like now, like what are we supposed to do while we wait for something to change here?
Mm-hmm.
So I want to come back to that. I'm just putting a little pin. If anyone's listening to this and they're like, yeah, well, there's a problem with the system. I think you acknowledge that in the
That's,
piece.
yeah.
It's just like, okay, but what do we tell people who are in the in between, in this kind of point? But yeah.
Yeah, and I appreciate you talking about kind of like the financial benefits and things like that. And I think in the piece you make it really clear that it's not about like kind of the cure to loneliness aspect of that we can kind of view marriage as. It's not like this like long-term answer or exclusive answer of how we can like care for our family, friends. But I guess kind of going back to what Chase just said, like kind of a challenge that the piece poses is like, what do we do while we wait for society to change? And so kind of seeing the ways that like, how do we take advantage of the benefits and legal protections that we do have access to now? And I was wondering kind of how you have thought through that.
Yeah. Yeah, so I truly believe that the fact that the state believes it has any say in marriage or not, or what benefits it gets, is literally a violation of separation in church and church and state. Which there's a whole reason I could get into. I'm a political junkie, everyone. I really am.
The
And
other side of Josh that no one gets to see.
I always told people if I cared nothing about Christianity and didn't want to become a pastor, I would have become a political analyst. Because
Oh,
I just love just like popcorn watching the world burn.
yeah. God was probably like, I can't have him do that. I
No,
just can't. It
no,
wouldn't be good for the world.
the
So
world does not need that.
we're gonna put
Um,
him in ministry.
we're going to put him in ministry. So I just get to watch it on the side. But so I believe it is actually legally within violation of the separation of church and state and how that operates within our judicial system. And I think that the fact that the federally recognized marriage carries the highest level of benefit and protections is actually like a product of the idolization of marriage that our culture suffers from. That like what side B
Yeah.
talks about.
Yeah.
The fact that the only way you can get all of these things is through marriage is, I think, ridiculous and crazy. I think some would argue that this is to encourage people to have kids, but the reason why I would say that's not true is because the benefits of having children are separate from marriage. Like you're going to get the tax cuts of having a child regardless of your marital status, regardless of all of those things. You get a certain percent, or you get a certain amount deducted from your taxes per child, per all of these things, because they want you to have children. Like the state needs it. The state needs us to have children, and our community is not really helping. But other people are helping.
Hey, I think we are helping and being the ones in other ways.
That's true. We are helping. We're just not the ones actually procreating them. So
No.
often, some of us are, but not all of them.
Some of us are.
Some of us are. But I do think I've mentioned this. I don't know. Maybe I've mentioned it somewhere. I know Eve Tushnet has made comments, even on Life on Side B, about the economic and social barriers of making celibacy sustainable, that it's kind of a rich man's game. Like you have to have the money to do it. Like that's what you need. And if you don't have that, she even talks about this is why often celibacy is more accessible within white communities, within much more upper class communities, within American, all of these things, unless you're going into an established institution such as a monastery, something of that format where you are accessing those benefits of that community, it becomes very challenging and there's a lot of barriers. And so I think in all of this, ultimately, yes, we need the legal system to change. I really believe that we need to get rid of, civil marriage and replace it with something else that gives a lot more access apart from the concept of marriage. Let marriage belong to the church. If you want to go get married, cool, but then legal benefits are something completely separate. But I think within how we do this, I think as people in celibate partnerships, we do this by pressing into the distinction, by having these conversations, because so often the two are muddled in our minds, especially as Americans, I think, that if we can help people see the separation of civil and church institutions, that can help us to change it. There's a quote my pastor has been quoting lately that I've been loving, by Dave Brooks or something like that. I can't remember. I think that's him, where he said, when a creative minority finds a more beautiful way to live, that's when culture shifts. And I think that that's what we do as Side B people. And I think that that's what we are doing in this situation. And I think in the midst of that, the other part that I give in this piece to people who maybe you read this piece and you're like, I'm not really convinced. I still don't think it's a great thing for people to pursue civil marriage. Cool. Great. How are you going to help? How are you going to help fix that? Because I don't think you can argue against the fact that these problems exist. Multiple people don't have the access to determine right now, again, maybe financially for other different reasons, who's going to be their emergency decision maker or related to getting health care, all of these things. So what can you do? How can you support them? Maybe you know the couple and you can offer somehow through your health insurance to help someone get health insurance. Cool. However it works, if you feel that conviction and people that are pursuing civil marriage, help deal with those barriers so that they don't have to do it. I don't think that it necessarily has to be that we get civilly married, but I think often we are challenged by people who don't want that to happen, but then do nothing to actually deal with the problems.
Yeah. Well, and Josh,
why do you think that is? Why do you think that is, Josh?
I think some of it is not knowing how to help, because I don't think people often have thought through it enough to realize why people are getting civilly married. I really do still believe a lot of people, well, it's not even that I believe this. This is legitimately, when I hear critics of celibate partnerships in general, it's often this critique of you're mimicking marriage, it's a sexless marriage, playing house, whatever. And I think that the critics are more concerned about me trying to pretend that I'm married than I'm concerned about me. I don't care about looking married. I don't care about any of it. And so I think in that way, often people, when they come up against this, there's a fear that people are doing it just because they're trying to get as close to same-sex marriage as possible. That's the pursuit of celibate partnerships. I will say, I think that a lot of times the critiques of civil marriage within celibate partnerships are strongly linked to the critiques just of celibate partnerships in general. And in general, I think a lot of critics, not saying that no one does it for this reason, but often I sometimes do spiritual direction for people discerning celibate partnerships. If two people are thinking about it, I've done sessions with people discerning it. And one of my biggest things is if you would rather be actually side A married to this person, don't get in a celibate partnership. That's not a person to be in a celibate partnership with. Go get married. Go do it. If that's what you want to do, go do it. That's not what this is. And I think a lot of people fear that that's just what's propelling them, is they just want to be a same-sex couple, married couple. But the reality is, so many of us, that's not it. That's not what we're pursuing. We really do hold to our convictions, and we're trying to live this out. And so I think that many times that's it. But then I also think there's an aspect of not knowing what to do. And so that's where I'm hoping this can at least distinguish. Here's the issues that lead us to that need.
Yeah. I mean, initially, too, one of your other points there, I mean, you haven't said it this way, and I think you're a better person for not saying it this way, but I will. And I think just that argument of well, put up or shut up, at a certain point, how are you going to help me then live in a way that is incongruent with the way that you're wanting me to, then apparently? Because there is a little bit of the world is built for people to get married. The world that we live in today is designed for people to move through life with the idea of getting married, having biological children, retiring. Everything is built out for that.
100%.
And this isn't even just for queer people who are single, it's for people who are single for whatever various reasons or celibate for various reasons.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The world is not built for the vast majority of people now, I feel like, or at least a good half of them who are not married or will not get married. I don't know. But I just think it is on the church to kind of be where is the church going to position itself, I guess? Are we going to be with the people on the margins, or are we going to be with the majority of the people in the mainstream of how society has always functioned? And I just think that the gospel would urge us to seek the people on the margins a little bit more. I think you could make some good biblical cases for what you're saying here. But if I can move it to this question here, because you kind of got to it in the last thing you said. You wrote in this piece, therefore, the appearance of evil argument has less to do with civil marriage and more to do with reservations about civil partnerships as a whole. It seems like I agree. Like, I think your arguments around the appearance of evil were one of the strongest in this piece for me, and I think for some of the other writers too at the collective. Could you speak more on that? Do you see the rejection by some of civil marriage to be related to respectability politics, and what is the possible danger of that approach?
Yeah, I do think that it's so linked to the thing that this is called marriage. I think if this was called, when same-sex marriage, quote unquote, had been passed and they had just decided to retitle everything as a federally civil union, I don't think we would be in the same place we are right now with this. I think the fact that this leans into the word marriage creates this thing, this hesitation around it. And so when one of the arguments I know has sometimes been used in this way is, well, okay, yeah, you've made the distinction. Like, in this piece, I explained why there is this distinction and why this isn't just even a thing we're creating. This is a thing actually most of the world holds. And that biblically is actually rooted in scripture, that civil marriage and church marriage are not the same thing. It's like, cool, that's a great thing that you understand, but are other people going to understand it? It's like, sure, but ultimately that's the same argument that people have used about us using the term gay. It's the exact same thing.
Yeah.
It's the thing of what people are going to assume. If I call Christian my partner, people are going to assume you're having sex. Of course, because they think everyone's having sex.
Girl, everyone thinks
everyone's having sex. And that's a whole
I am decidedly not, actually.
Yeah. And also, I think the fact of I think that with that's obviously not a good assumption happening in our culture. That speaks to a much larger issue of, I do think our American culture both fears and is obsessed with sex so much. Comes from our Puritan background a lot and how that rooted into it. But I do think that ultimately I can't fear just how someone's going to interpret the words. Now, granted, if they have some kind of power over me, if they have a thing of whether guarding my employment, I don't know, whatever they might have, that's something different, maybe. But in the general public, I don't believe, and I actually would say scripture argues this as well, that if we're just going off of how something looks versus what it is at the heart, we are actually becoming much more of a legalistic teacher mindset, because this is even what Paul is talking about. One of the arguments I use in the piece is about the food given to idols or dedicated to idols. And Paul's like, cool, we know what it is. And so therefore it doesn't matter. But, if you have a conviction against it, then don't, that's also fine. And so I just think that ultimately when you root into the concerns about civil marriage, they often play into the reservations about celibate partnerships as a whole. And ultimately people are going to have that assumption whether or not I was civilly married. They're going to have those same reservations about the appearance of evil just by seeing us as a romantic couple, in that way.
Yeah.
No. Mm-hmm.
I appreciate you saying that. I said, I think it's an important argument to make, because I don't know. And in one sense, I'm in today's world, honestly, just by virtue of being gay in a Christian context, in a conservative Christian context, even there's an appearance of evil, even if I am not done anything evil yet. or
Yeah.
whatever you want to call it. And believe me, I think to one of the points you've made, and I think this is really the greatest tragedy of this whole situation, is that that kind of situation sets you up to not find anyone who can actually give you good, honest accountability.
Yeah.
Because, like, I've now shut myself off from everyone because
Hmm.
they're already assuming the worst. And it's
Yep.
like, well, then who can I actually be honest to? And who do I go to then when I am like needing some assistance or
Yeah.
needing someone to talk to? It isn't going to be the conservative church that I go to.
No.
You've cut yourself off from that conversation. And I
Hmm.
think that's the tragedy, really. But anyway, I can get heated up on that point.
Love it. No, and I do think it, and it's even funny, I would say, kind of back to what we were talking about earlier with the people like, listen, you either need to do something or shut your mouth kind of thing. I also think it's really ironic that a lot of times the people that will have hesitations, not always, will be people who are in opposite sex civil
I
marriage.
was going to say it, but you did, so thank you.
And I'm like, so you're benefiting from these very things that you're
Well,
well, yeah, and I think that is the part I think that is really sad and really hard because it's like you're having an issue with me having the very thing that you have found beneficial in your life, or else you wouldn't have gotten civilly married. Like if this is not an issue, I've literally talked with this with some people going, okay, if you feel, because sometimes this has been argued like, well, I think you're overblowing the benefits of this. This shouldn't really be as big.
Yeah,
And I'm
sure.
like, cool, then get civilly divorced. Remain church marriage, but get civilly divorced. If these are not important enough to have, then
Mhm.
live your life that way as well.
Yeah, you go first.
You go first. And so I think that those are questions to have. Now, I do think that one thing I do want to also say with the appearance of evil aspect, kind of going into the idolization of marriage aspect, and those things. Like I said, the one area I do like to respect about appearance of things is around celibate people who maybe don't have an intentional community,
Yeah.
don't have committed relationships, don't have a celibate partnership,
yeah,
those
yeah,
kinds of things. I want to respect the reality that I have, not just because of my partner, but because of my family, my community.
Mm.
I might have something that they might not have. And while I've been very clear about this many times, listeners, you've probably heard me say this on the podcast, I'm not going to curate my life for that. But I also want to be sensitive about that and honoring about that. And I think that's what Paul is calling us to in that First Corinthians passage about the weaker brother
mm,
of like, hey, I'm not going to flaunt around this, as we were talking about before, as the answer
Right.
to all of my loneliness.
Right.
It's not. I was lonely like just earlier this month. I was like really
Right.
going through a really hard time. And, like it doesn't cure that. But I want to be sensitive to it, understanding that these are people that don't have it. But when it comes to critics who are like, that other person at your church is going to think that you're a married gay couple. I'm like, well, I don't care. That's their thing. Like
They probably already do.
they probably already do. So that I also wanted to make that distinction within the appearance of
Yeah.
evil.
I appreciate that. I think that's good to recognize is that, yeah, this is not a cure-all
Yeah.
for like all of a sudden you get civilly married and now your
You're done.
life is, and now you can do side B in the right way.
Right.
That's not what this is. No.
I've always been another area I've always been adamant with celibate partnerships is that celibate partnerships should never be talked about in a dichotomy against mixed orientation marriage. I will never, within the realm I talk about it in that way. I like to talk about it within the realm of intentional community. Because I don't know who said it. It might have been on the Life on Side B episode with Max on celibate partnerships from season 1, but somewhere someone called celibate partnerships a monastery of two. And I think that that's a beautiful way of understanding it is like, it's a form of intentional community. Whether or not you have 2, 3, 6, however many people in your community, it's an intentional community. So I think speaking about celibate partnerships within that sphere, rather than putting it as this dichotomy against mixed orientation marriage, I think is one that I really like to hold very strongly, or like talking about it as its own institution, because I don't think it is that. I just think it's, as you were saying, we live in a society that couples people. We all like end up coupling up. And I think the struggling of intentional communities around us have shown we naturally, our brains are like geared towards coupling in some way. And so it's just a natural way to start community, if nothing else.
Yeah, I guess we've been mostly talking about like this conversation with in church contexts.
Hmm.
But like outside of the church, there have been conversation in recent years about a rise in kind of queer platonic partnerships that are seeking legal recognition, using marriage to do so. There was a New York Times article in like 2021 that talked about like the rise of such marriages. There are now like law firms explaining your rights about like
Yes.
entering a platonic marriage. And so a lot of the conversations arising from Obergefell and kind of like the right to marry that it infers. How do you kind of see celibate partnerships role in these conversations? And like, do you see that there's a way for the church to engage in these broader secular conversations as well about expanding the definition of marriage?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, and again, I think that when we talk about expanding the definition of marriage, we're talking legally. I want to clarify that because ultimately we're holding to that church wise. But I do really feel the more the church can actively take a role in petitioning for marriage to no longer have a legal status and to replace it with some form of civil union, I think our country would be in a better place. You know, our country is in a weird like shift more conservative, which is just a whole nother conversation. And so I think conversations around whether or not pastors should be required to perform same-sex marriages, it was a thing that was starting a while ago, and those conversations have died down. I know there was a moment when activists were talking about whether or not churches should lose their tax exemption status if a pastor refused to marry a same-sex couple. Ultimately, the reason they're doing that is not actually to change. The reason they wanted to talk about that was not because they wanted to change a church's view, maybe some, but I think the problem was the restriction of benefits, the restriction of protections. So I think the more we can remove that from the church conversation, I think, you know, in countries where that's not the model, the conversation around whether pastors should marry same-sex couples is not even an issue. Because whoever a pastor marries has no legal standing. Like that's just about them. It's about judges, whoever, you know, those kinds of things. So, and I actually think if we could take that realm of actually supporting that as a church, which honestly shouldn't be that hard, but I do think for some reason we're just still not at the place of doing that, is actually a way that the church, even from our traditional belief on sacramental marriage, could come alongside the LGBTQ community and actually join forces politically, which would be like a crazy thing to see. But that's not I don't see that happening. So I do think, who knows, you know, God, who knows? But I do think that celibate partnerships play a role in these kind of like queer platonic partnerships in the conversation about kind of redefining what is romance, what is relationship, what is prioritization of relationship, and this kind of exclusivity aspect that often has been so important within our relationships that often does not exist in celibate partnerships in the same way. And so I do think we actually have something to offer many times to the broader LGBTQ community and the church in this way. Yeah.
Yeah. I appreciate a lot of what you're saying there, Josh, because I think that there's just the sense that we, like, oftentimes I think within this side B community, and then in particular celibate partnerships, and then even those who are considering civil marriage within that, like, we often become kind of like, I don't want to say this in a weird way, but like it's kind of a laboratory, if you will. You know what I mean? Like, is this we kind of go to places by virtue of our convictions and our faith that we have. We go to these spaces where we're like, is it possible to have a life in this way? And
Mm-hmm.
then we work hard to see if we can actually construct that life. Like you quoted from your pastor, that one David Brooks quote. I'm like, I
Yeah,
think
David
that's
Brooks. Yeah.
yeah, I think that's a great segue here, because another question we were thinking about when we were, I think it was Johanna Marie too brought this up, I think, when we were reading through your piece, was you mentioned in the piece that queer folks in the past have used different legal structures, right, to build family. And she brought up the point of adult adoption. Those who don't know Johanna Marie, she's like a really great historian. So she like knows, she would be
Yes.
the one to bring up, well, did you know like back in the 60s we would do this? I'm like, oh yeah, I did not know that. Thank you.
Yes. Oh,
Yeah. So, and I mean, that to me is also kind of a funny, it's to our contemporary audience, or to me even, like I'm like, ooh, the idea of adopting someone that I'm in a relationship with sounds very like taboo, would not do
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
But I can understand the context in which they did that,
Hmm.
historically speaking, especially when it came to a lot of different situations going on in the 60s, 70s, and into the 80s and 90s. Like, I'm wondering if could you speak to how you see the use of civil marriage by celibate partnerships as a continuation of that legacy to, I guess, how do we this rebuilding of legal structures, or this using legal structures to rebuild how we construct our families?
Yeah.
How does
Yeah.
celibate partnership using civil marriage fit into that queer legacy?
Yeah. Yeah. Really quick point, funny enough point, as I was researching
Yeah,
for this,
yeah,
I
yeah,
found actually a case in the last 5 years where a couple that had done adult adoption back in
yeah.
the 80s or something, now realizing it's not as helpful for them and because of the dynamics, they want to get married. But one is the other's father's. The father basically of this situation had to disown the son so that
Oh
then
my
it
gosh.
was a whole thing. But that's because they used something that helps them and it no longer helps them.
Yeah,
I
it's
think,
like,
yeah, go ahead.
gosh, I want that novel. I know that's like there's a story, yeah, there's
Yes, 100%. Um, yeah, I think that if you look back at the LGBT movement, there's always been this tension between what like is kind of like the queer liberation aspect of the LGBT movement, which has always been about
Hmm.
breaking norms, just like not wanting to fit in the heteronormative bubble box, that kind of thing. And kind of the more gay respectability, I know back in the 60s, it was known as the homophile movement kind of aspect.
Hmm.
And it was that general idea of we just want to be seen as we're straight people. We just also like, the same sex, which
Mhm.
is fine. And I think most movements have this tension of respectability and like breaking the bonds, like always most movements will have. And it's funny enough, I think the goal to pass gay marriage was seen by the broader culture as like the end result. Cause I think once gay marriage
Yes.
passed, people were like, cool, we've done it. Great. You know,
Yep.
all
Yep.
done.
Yep. Yep.
And in fact, I think that gay marriage by the LGBTQ community was more seen as a belief that like gay marriage was at least a tangible goal within the respectability game. Because
Yep.
actually, if you really talk to a lot of LGBT people, sure, there are some that just see their relationship as a marriage, just like any other relationship and just with a person of the same sex. But LGBT people actually very often don't see their relationships as marriages in the same way that straight relationships do. It just doesn't work within that same bound. And honestly, I think that's one of my own reasons. That one of the reasons that has actually supported my own side B convictions around sacramental marriage is just a whole thing of seeing like when you actually look at what most LGBT relationship formats are, that it's not actually pursuing marriage. I think same sex marriage was just a respectability game of what was
Mhm.
tangible goals. And so I believe like the queer legacy of family building is about because we don't want to live in a box. We don't want to be put in a box. And I think that celibate partnerships play into that because that's literally what we're saying. We don't want to be a married couple. We just want the
Mm.
rights and the benefits to exist. And
Yeah.
Yes.
and we're going to use the law as it's able to figure out a way to do that right now. And it's what queer people have been doing, will continue to do in all of these ways. And I think that that gets into a long, like another
Yeah.
discussion around the codification of morality and how that has worked into like Western society. I think often we need to more put it into like allow the law to just give benefits to its citizens and
Mm.
not trying to box in this way. So I do think it continues that kind of box breaking part of the queer movement apart from respectability, politics.
Yeah. No, and I think that to me is the most compelling part of this piece. And I mean, I know you, again, I think you're just a better person than me in how you
No.
have, well, no, in terms of like, you're able to say it in a way that like, oh, people will appreciate it. So I just feel like for me, it's like, I deserve these rights, damn
Yeah,
it.
that's
Like,
it.
but there's nothing different, inherently different about my relationship with this person where I shouldn't be able to experience the same benefits. Like I just don't. I think that that's the point. Is what makes your marriage inherently better in some way than the relationship that I have, to where you now have more rights
Yeah.
than I
Yeah.
do. As a married person, you have, and this isn't just straight people getting married, this is like gay people getting married too. Like, I mean, the structure, the system, and I guess I kind of am compelled by the idea of, fine, then I'm going to get married and show you how silly this whole system is.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah. I want
yeah.
to add one thing there, which was when I was working on this piece, because in the section where I talk about, the queer legacy of kind of using law and even the Christian legacy in African and Middle Eastern cultures, one of the pastors at my church is Kenyan and comes from a family where multiple men in his family have multiple wives. I wanted to talk to him because I wanted to make sure I was engaging with it well in that part. And he also opened up my eyes to a really fascinating reality that in our minds, we can't imagine a world where marriage isn't like a civil, like product that gives you benefits and all of these things. And I thought I didn't get to put this in the piece just because if I put everything in the piece I wanted to, it'd be a book, and we don't need that right now. But he was explaining how even in Kenya, the reality that there's like civil law and there's customary law, and it's a whole thing of a difference within African culture. A lot of the civil law is brought on them by Western society, and customary law is from the ancient African traditions, and every country deals with it a little bit differently of how they merge civil or like Western law and African law within these things, but that often the full idea of civil marriage was actually first brought by Europeans to force monogamy onto the cultures. That it was created as a way to force them into this situation. And the reality is that then there's other countries where, as I was saying, where polygamy is allowed legally. But there are some countries where it still isn't. But it's funny how many times, I would even say in the United States, the purpose of civil marriage in the beginning was to literally force morality on people. That's what it was there for, was to force morality. And I think we've learned as Christians that doesn't work. You can't like codify morality in the sense of like as a church to get people to heaven.
Right.
I think that we need to understand that what is the law, that the church's operations need to be separate from the government. Something that the church apparently still needs to learn in what our current situation is that politics will not save the church. And I think that we need to figure out how to operate separate than that. And so the very fact that civil marriage exists as it does, I think is a result of the church trying to force it, not only in the United States, but in other countries. The reality is other countries have been able to move outside of that box very quickly. And the United States has really stuck into this box for this purpose, I think, many times.
Thanks for adding that.
So I think we would love to kind of tease a part two that you're
Yeah.
going to share for the collective.
Yeah. There's more.
There is more. I would love to hear some more about kind of your thoughts on the part two of kind of like the practicals for folks who are in celibate partnerships, and what was your kind of like your thinking behind developing that?
Yeah. Honestly, this whole section, originally all of this was going to be one piece, but then wisely y'all and your team was like, no, this feels like it should be two. And I agree. It really is. And I actually have to thank this entire section to Chase, because Chase, it was really when you were the one who spurred on like, hey, I think you should talk about this. And I was like, sure. But I felt it's so funny because I always feel very hesitant to give advice like in celibate partnerships necessarily, only because so many are so different. And it's like, and also as the scary part is like, as much as it seems like I've been doing this a while, 4 years is not a lot. So I was very nervous, but I actually am really happy with how this piece came out. And so the goal of it is, okay, so you're in a celibate partnership, or maybe not. I want to clarify that this doesn't just have to be for celibate partners. I think that take the same sex side out of it, and a side B celibate man and a side B celibate woman could decide that they want to be civilly married to reap benefits, or however that looks, that you can decide how you want to use this. And these are just steps for people who have made a lifelong commitment, because I think that's really important before civil marriage is a thing you want to take, because legal divorce can get really, really complicated. And so I think that, so this piece is just going, okay, so you are considering whether or not this is a step you need to take. How do you go about that? And so just kind of work through, and I like some of the things I would recommend from like kind of reevaluating what is my commitment, like what is our commitment within this relationship as individuals, the questions to ask, like what are your concerns? Because, you know, like what are the things that, is it healthcare issues? Is it visa issues? Is it inheritance? Whatever it is. And ultimately, again, this is not, it should never be posed as a question of, should we get civilly married or not? If that's the question, I think we need to reframe it into what is the best solution for our concerns. Because sometimes, depending on your situation, civil marriage can actually harm you. Depending on your income, it can actually make you pay more taxes. Some people don't know that, but as the son of an accountant, I have learned it. It can make you pay more taxes. It can make different things more complicated. Like I said, if you got civilly married and you end up not spending life together, then you have to go through a divorce. So there's all the different kinds of things. But this piece is just really meant to look through, how do you consider all of the facets that go into that. And so I'm hoping it can be helpful for anyone who's considering this not as a church marriage, but as a civil protection and benefit format.
Yeah. No, I think that's going to be so helpful to so many people, because, and something I think we've talked about maybe outside of this podcast or this, and even in developing this piece, is just there aren't many, if any, real resources for people in celibate partnerships in general.
No.
And it feels maybe like, I don't know, we just have a dearth of any kind of information. And I think this won't be the be all end all. And I hope we never put you in that position where you have to do that. But I think it will function hopefully as a wonderful invitation for other people to give some godly insight into this and how we relate in the world that we live in, and try and hold to the convictions and the love that we have in the people that are in our lives as best as we can.
Yeah. I appreciate that.
I'm so stinking like grateful for you, and like so happy that we get to share this piece.
Yes.
Yeah, Shelby, what are your like any concluding thoughts or questions on your end?
Yeah, I'm just so grateful for your voice and your advocacy. I think, as you kind of mentioned from the top, we're in a very particular political moment. And so I think it's even more important now than ever to be kind of thinking about these topics and kind of thinking about, like, as a community, how do we wrestle with these things? And I appreciate you being willing to, like, forge the frontier in that sense.
Thank you.
I hope that this piece and this conversation helps to further the conversation and lead to more conversation and discussion, so that it's not everyone thinks this one way, everyone thinks this other way, but like opens up an avenue for a further conversation.
I appreciate all of that. And I like I said, I really just have to thank you guys and Grant, Johanna Marie, and your whole team for being willing to take the risk on this piece and letting it be a thing. Yeah. And if you have critiques or you have hate mail, send them to josh@holyourselves.org. Why not? I'll listen to it. Sure.
Or just yell at Grant. He's on
or
Twitter.
Yell at
I think
Grant.
He's the only
Grant's
on Twitter.
Yes.
You can find him.
Yeah, no, I am glad to put out this piece. I've always been very intentional. I know that there are a few celibate partnerships that are outspoken, and I don't want to become a spokesperson of them, but I also realize there's not a lot out there, as you said. There's just not a lot. And so trying to be intentional about contributing so that these conversations can happen, but also understanding that, like, this is our discussion. And like Shelby, I think you mentioned just before, and we said multiple times in this thing, is that this plays into a bigger role of like we have to discuss, how do we make this plausible as we get older, as we start having some serious questions about retirement, about, all different
Yeah.
kinds of aspects. As a community, I hope that this can play a part in it. So thank you guys for it.
Yeah, absolutely. Guys, everyone listening in, the piece is called The Case for Civil Marriage in Celibate Partnerships by Josh Proctor. You can find it over at Side B Collective. It is available now, and then hopefully very shortly we will have a follow-up piece that we're looking forward to as well. Josh, thanks for letting us just take over the Life on Side B podcast.
Crash it for a little bit.
Yeah,
It's yours anytime you want it. Come on in.
Thank you so much.
All right.
All right.
It's good to
Thanks.
talk to you guys. And listeners, as always, I love you. So there we are. Yeah. All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye.